Alastair Finch, a name synonymous with monolithic skyscrapers and ruthless acquisitions, surveyed the sterile opulence of the private hospital suite with an air of profound irritation. His daughter, Arabella, lay unnervingly still beneath pristine white sheets, a porcelain doll trapped in a silent, unending sleep. For 3 months, the finest medical minds money could procure had prodded, scanned, and conferred, their hushed pronouncements always culminating in the same infuriating shrug. Now, his patience, a notoriously shallow reservoir, was utterly depleted. He paced the plush carpet, the rhythmic tap of his Italian leather shoes a counterpoint to the quiet beeping of machines that did little more than confirm she was still, technically, alive. Outside the soundproof door, the world held its breath, or so the newspapers dramatically claimed. Millionaire's heiress in mysterious coma, the headlines blared, each word a fresh indignity to Alastair Finch. He loathed weakness, and this public display of his family's vulnerability, his own powerlessness, was a galling affront. It was during one of his imperious sweeps through the hospital's lower corridors, a place he usually avoided as if it were plague-ridden, that he encountered the boy. Thin, almost spectral, with eyes that seemed to hold ancient sorrows, the young black orphan, known only as David, was polishing brass fixtures near the service elevator, a task he performed with a quiet, unnerving diligence. David had heard the whispers, the hushed anxieties of nurses, the frustrated sighs of doctors. He had seen Finch's thunderous face on his rare descents from the penthouse suite where Arabella lay. And one crisp morning, as Finch was about to step into his chauffeured limousine, David had approached, his voice barely a tremor in the vast, indifferent city air. "Sir," he'd said, his gaze direct, yet respectful. "Mr. Finch. I believe I can help your daughters." Finch had stopped, one hand on the car door, an eyebrow arched in incredulous disdain. He looked David up and down, a slow, contemptuous appraisal that lingered on the boy's worn clothes and hollow cheeks. "Help her?" Finch's laugh was a dry, rasping sound, like stones grinding together. "And how, pray tell, would you help her, boy? Are you a renowned neurologist I've somehow overlooked? A miracle worker hiding in the guise of a polisher of doorknobs?" The chauffeur smirked. A passing socialite, Mrs. Harrington, paused, her expression a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled amusement. David stood his ground, his small frame unbent. "I can pray for her, sir." "My prayers, they are sometimes heard." Finch's face contorted, a mask of aristocratic outrage. "Prayers?" He spat the word out. "You come to me, Alastair Finch, with an offer of prayers? From a starving street urchin? This is preposterous." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a wad of bills, and callously peeled one off, a meager note. He thrust it towards David. "Here. Go buy yourself a decent meal. Stop peddling your superstitious nonsense to those who deal in reality." The bill fluttered from Finch's fingers and landed on the grimy pavement. David did not stoop to pick it up. His eyes, for a fleeting moment, seemed to flash with an inner fire, quickly banked. "My prayers are not for sale, sir," he said softly, his dignity a stark contrast to Finch's boorish display. "And they are more real than you can imagine." He turned and walked away, leaving Finch fuming, Mrs. Harrington tittering, and the banknote lying like a soiled accusation on the cold concrete. The incident, however, gnawed at Finch. Days turned into weeks. Arabella remained lost to them. The doctors began to speak in even softer, more somber tones, their suggestions dwindling. Desperation, a sentiment Finch despised, began to prick at the edges of his formidable ego. It was Mrs. Harrington, ironically, who planted the seed. "Alastair, darling," she'd cooed over cocktails at an exclusive club, her voice dripping with insincere sympathy, "perhaps you should let the little orphan boy try. What harm could it do? At this point, even a bit of primitive charm might be worth a go. And think of the story. If it works, a miracle. If not, well, a rather amusing anecdote for the memoirs, wouldn't you say?" Her words, intended perhaps to subtly mock, struck an unexpected chord in Finch's Machiavellian mind. An anecdote. A spectacle. If the boy failed, as he undoubtedly would, it would be a public demonstration of the futility of such sentimental, lower-class beliefs. It would reaffirm his own worldview, his faith in tangible power and wealth over ephemeral faith. It could even be spun as Finch, the benevolent tycoon, extending a desperate, humanitarian hand to even the lowliest suggestion in his grief. His lips curved into a cruel smile. He would orchestrate it perfectly. He summoned David, not with courtesy, but with a curt command delivered through a stony-faced hospital administrator. The boy appeared, still clad in his threadbare clothes, but with that same unnerving calm. "So," Finch began, his voice laced with a magnet's condescending authority, from behind his vast mahogany desk in Arabella's now crowded hospital suite. He had invited a select audience, a few influential board members, a skeptical journalist known for his cynical prose, and of course, Mrs. Harrington, eyes gleaming with anticipation. Doctors stood by, their expressions carefully neutral. "You still believe your prayers can achieve what the best medical science in the world cannot?" David simply nodded. "I do, sir, very well," Finch declared, a grandiloquent sweep of his hand encompassing the room. "Then you shall have your chance. Let us all bear witness to this marvel you propose." He leaned back, a king granting a foolish peasant an audience. "Proceed, boy." Amaze us. The room was thick with a mixture of pity, skepticism, and morbid curiosity. Mrs. Harrington dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though her smile was predatory. The journalist had his notepad ready. Finch watched, a smirk playing on his lips, already composing the dismissive quotes he would feed the press later. He imagined the headlines: "Orphan's futile prayers fail to rouse heiress, Finch's grief exploited." It would be a small, bitter amusement in his sea of frustration. David, seemingly oblivious to the charged atmosphere, walked slowly towards Arabella's bedside. He did not look at her still face, not yet. Instead, he closed his eyes, his thin hands clasped before him. The silence in the room became absolute, broken only by the soft, rhythmic sigh of the ventilator. Finch tapped his fingers impatiently, the smirk hardening. This was taking too long. The boy was probably trying to remember some mumbo-jumbo he'd overheard. He was about to bark an order to hurry it up when David began to speak. His voice, though quiet, filled the room with an unexpected resonance, a clarity that cut through the oppressive tension. It was not the fervent, ecstatic babbling Finch had anticipated. It was measured, almost conversational, yet imbued with a profound, sorrowful gravity. And the words were not what anyone expected. David did not begin with pleas for healing, nor did he invoke lofty celestial beings with grand pronouncements. Instead, his voice, a low, melodic cadence, began to weave a story, a lament disguised as a prayer. "Oh, Spirit of Truth," David began, his eyes still closed, "remember Elena, a woman of grace and laughter, who loved the scent of jasmine and the sound of a distant violin. Remember her kindness, so easily betrayed, her trust, so cruelly shattered." Alastair Finch, who had been leaning forward with an expression of bored indulgence, suddenly stiffened. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Elena. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in decades. David continued, his voice gaining a subtle strength. "Remember the promises made beneath a summer moon, promises of forever, of shared futures, promises broken like brittle glass when a richer prize appeared. Remember the ink that flowed on documents, signing away not just a fortune, but a life, a heritage, a son's birthright." The air in the room grew colder. The journalist's pen froze mid-scribble. Mrs. Harrington's smirk faltered, replaced by a confused frown. Finch's face was slowly draining of color. His knuckles, gripping the arms of his chair, were white. "Remember a small boy," David's voice trembled, now undeniably infused with a deep, personal pain, sent away with his mother, into the shadows of poverty and despair, while opulence bloomed in a stolen garden. "Remember the letters unanswered, the pleas unheard, the slow, heartbreaking fate of a gentle soul who deserved so much more than silence and neglect." A small gasp escaped one of the nurses. The doctors exchanged uneasy glances. This was no ordinary prayer. This was an indictment. Suddenly, a monitor beside Arabella's bed, one that had been tracing a flat, monotonous line of minimal brain activity, emitted a sharp, unexpected beep. Then another. A faint flutter of Arabella's eyelids. Dr. Albright, the chief neurologist, leaned forward, his professional composure momentarily fracturing into disbelief. "Impossible," he muttered. David seemed not to notice. His voice rose, imbued with a righteous sorrow. "Remember the lies piled upon lies, a fortress built to hide a hollow core. Remember the name Alastair Finch, and the legacy he sought to build on the foundations of deceit and a woman's stolen tears." At that precise moment, Arabella's hand, lying limply on the white coverlet, twitched. Her fingers curled, then uncurled. A soft moan escaped her lips. Her eyelids fluttered again, then, slowly, miraculously, they opened. Her gaze was unfocused at first, then it drifted, finding David. A flicker of recognition, faint but undeniable, sparked in their depths. Her lips moved, forming a word, raspy from disuse. "D.A. David," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. Then, her eyes, gaining clarity, shifted, locking onto her father. A shadow of profound understanding, and something akin to horror, filled them. "Father," she breathed, her voice gaining a shocking strength. What did you do to Mama Elena?" I remember her songs," and then, darkness, the room erupted. Not in cheers, but in stunned, horrified silence. Alastair Finch looked as if he had been struck by lightning, his face a grotesque mask of shock and dawning terror. The prayer had not been a plea to God, it had been a key, unlocking a door in Arabella's traumatized mind, a door her father had desperately tried to keep bolted shut. David opened his eyes, the calm within them a stark contrast to the storm now raging in Alastair Finch's soul. He looked at Arabella, a gentle, sorrowful smile touching his lips. "She never forgot you, Arabella," he said softly. "And I never forgot her. Or you." He then turned to face the dumbfounded assembly, his gaze sweeping over the shocked faces, finally resting on the now ashen Alastair Finch. "For 25 years, David's voice resonated with the undeniable weight of truth. This man, Alastair Finch, has lived a lie. My mother, Elena Reyes, was his first wife. Arabella is my half-sister." Gasps rippled through the room. Mrs. Harrington looked as if she might faint. The journalist was scribbling furiously, his earlier cynicism replaced by avaricious excitement. "My mother," David continued, his voice steady despite the tremor of long-suppressed grief, was an heiress in her own right. Her family's modest but substantial fortune was the seed money for Finch's first ventures. When he met Arabella's mother, a woman with far greater connections and wealth, he systematically and cruelly divorced Elena, using fraudulent documents to seize her entire inheritance, an inheritance that was meant to be shared by her children, by me, and by Arabella. Had she known, he reached into the worn satchel he always carried, a satchel no one had ever paid any mind. From it, he began to withdraw a series of items, laying them carefully on the polished side table. "I have spent my life in the shadows, Mr. Finch, working menial jobs, always close, always watching, always gathering what you tried so desperately to bury." He held up a faded photograph. "This is my mother, Elena, with a much younger, less prosperous Alastair Finch. Notice the date, and the genuine affection he once feigned next, a creased birth certificate. Mine. Clearly stating Alastair Finch as my father and Elena Reyes as my mother, then, a sheaf of documents. These are copies of the original financial agreements between my mother and Mr. Finch. And these," he produced another set, "are the forged papers he used to dispossess her, along with bank statements showing the illicit transfer of her assets into his burgeoning accounts. It took years, sifting through discarded records, finding disgruntled former employees, even befriending the aging clerk who remembered your urgent, late-night demands for certain signatures." He looked directly at Finch, whose bravado had utterly crumbled, leaving behind a terrified, cornered old man. "My mother died in poverty, Mr. Finch, her heart broken not just by your greed but by your utter abandonment of her, and of me. I was 7. I promised her, on her deathbed, that one day the truth would be known. That her name would be cleared, and her legacy restored." He gestured towards Arabella, who was now sitting up slightly, supported by a bewildered Dr. Albright, tears streaming down her face as she listened. "I knew Arabella was innocent in all of this. I knew that if she could only hear the truth, unvarnished, it might reach her. Her coma, I believe, was her soul's retreat from a truth too terrible to consciously bear about the father she loved. My prayers were not for a divine miracle, but a human one, a spark of memory, a connection to the truth that binds us. The evidence was irrefutable, laid bare under the harsh hospital lights. The public unraveling was swift and brutal. Finch's empire of deceit, so carefully constructed, was collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. His carefully curated image of the benevolent patriarch, the captain of industry, was being shredded before the very eyes of those whose opinions he most valued. The journalist, no longer cynical but electrified by the scoop of a lifetime, was already subtly dictating into his phone, his words painting a damning portrait of Alastair Finch. The titan of industry, unmasked as a common thief, a heartless manipulator who built his fortune on the ruins of his first wife's life and legacy. Mrs. Harrington, ever the opportunist, was inching away from Finch, her face a mask of horrified disapproval, as if she hadn't been ghoulishly anticipating a spectacle just moments before. The board members looked at each other, their expressions grim. The Finch name, once a golden brand, was now irrevocably tarnished. Police, alerted by a swift call from a suddenly righteous hospital administrator who smelled a scandal far bigger than a medical mystery, were already en route. The downfall of Alastair Finch was as spectacular as it was public. His world, built on arrogance and illusion, imploded. His reputation, meticulously crafted over decades, was annihilated in a matter of hours. News of his arrest, amidst flashing cameras and shouted questions, dominated every news cycle. The charges were severe: fraud, embezzlement, perjury, and even investigations into culpable neglect contributing to Elena Reyes's untimely death. His assets were frozen, his companies thrown into turmoil. The sycophants who had once flocked to his side vanished like mist in the morning sun, leaving him utterly alone to face the catastrophic consequences of his own hubris. His downfall was not merely financial or legal, it was a profound moral collapse, a public shaming that stripped away every veneer of respectability. He had sought to humiliate a starving orphan, to make a mockery of faith and dignity, and in doing so, had orchestrated his own spectacular demise. The dramatic irony was crushingly absolute. The very stage he had set for David's perceived failure became the platform for his own exposure. In the aftermath, David, no longer the invisible orphan but recognized as David Reyes Finch, and Arabella, frail but resolute, began the arduous task of picking up the pieces. The reclaimed fortune, substantial even after Finch's plundering, was not a source of ostentatious celebration, but a solemn responsibility. Together, they established the Elena Reyes Foundation for Justice and Dignity. Its mission was twofold: to provide aid and education to orphaned and underprivileged children, especially those from marginalized communities who had been systematically underestimated, and to offer legal support to victims of financial fraud and exploitation, those whose lives had been shattered by the greed of others. David, with his quiet strength and profound empathy, became the guiding force of the foundation. He exchanged his worn clothes not for designer suits, but for the simple, dignified attire of a man dedicated to service. He was often found not in a lavish office, but in the crowded community centers and shelters his foundation supported, his presence a beacon of hope. Arabella, having confronted the devastating truth about her father, found healing in action. She threw herself into the foundation's work, her medical recovery paralleled by a journey of emotional and moral awakening. The bond between the half-siblings, forged in tragedy and truth, became a testament to resilience. Their victory was not one of revenge, but of restoration, the restoration of a mother's honor, of a stolen birthright, and most importantly, of faith in the enduring power of truth. The world saw not a tale of vengeance, but an inspiring narrative of how quiet courage and unwavering integrity could dismantle even the most formidable citadels of deceit. The final moral resonated far beyond the courtroom and the society pages. It spoke to the insidious nature of prejudice, which blinds the powerful to the worth and potential of those they deem beneath them. It championed the quiet dignity of the underestimated, proving that true strength often resides not in bluster and wealth, but in resilience and moral clarity. Alastair Finch had looked at a starving black orphan and seen nothing of value, nothing to fear. He had failed to understand that the most potent power is not hoarded in bank vaults or displayed in boardrooms, but carried within the human heart, a quiet, unyielding flame of truth that, when its moment comes, can illuminate the darkest corners and consume the grandest illusions. For in the grand theatre of life, it is often those who are dismissed and downtrodden who possess the clearest vision, and the most profound capacity to change the world, not with a roar, but with the unwavering whisper of long-held truth.